For example, I'll give you an example. There's a guy, an academic we invited, who, he was in the news. We decided to go with him, and it was a non-Muslim guy, and then he decided to have, a Twitter war where he talked about he's pro-Russia, pro-Syria, Assad, and he was very clear, very open about this. And I remember then having a conversation and saying, look, I'm afraid I can't, I find this very difficult to invite you onto my show if you're going to be very openly pro-Assad. And actually, to the degree that he was belittling the Uyghur genocide, and he was suggesting that all of the opposition to Assad are terrorists, right? And fine, if this wasn't just an academic article he had written, it's tucked away somewhere on the internet. This is his main argument. He has this anti-imperialist worldview. And so I disinvited him and said, look, it's just not for us. And it was an amicable exchange, but we're not going to invite people like that onto our show.
I'm glad you mentioned that example, because it would be relevant to my next question, which is, much of today's conversation is going to be about the ongoing genocide in Gaza and how it's impacted us here in the UK, especially with a general election looming. Yeah. But many of the outspoken, at least online, many of the outspoken advocates of the Palestinian cause have been those who take very principled positions on that conflict. But on those conflicts and issues, they border denial to enabling. Yeah. Right,
like on Syria.
Yeah, like on Syria. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I mean, we have Galloway as a prime example. I remember you even tweeted, alluding to it directly, indirectly, that look, is the situation that desperate whereby we need people who deny X, Y, and Z to talk about Palestine? We can name others, right? So there's been lots of people who seem very outspoken and have amplified the voice, at least on X and beyond. But at the same time, they hold very, very problematic positions on Syria, on Assad, on the Uyghur situation, and generally Russia as an imperialistic power in the world, and how its hands are drenched in the blood of Muslims. How do you do that? How do you balance it out? So what's your thoughts on that? Is that one of your red lines?
It certainly is a red line for me. I mean, and by the way, I'm not going to say that everyone needs to apply my criteria to guess, because I think
I'm just curious. I really want to know for one podcast or another.
No doubt about it. We certainly will have different criteria, and I'm not going to say your criteria is any worse than mine or better than mine. It's just the way we are. Look, my view is that where there are people who actively engage in a narrative which dispossesses some of our Muslim ummah from their lives and their wealth and their lands, because it falls within this anti-imperialism banner. So George Galloway is a prime example of that. George Galloway, for me, is a charlatan. He's someone who makes his life's aim. He makes his agenda is based on this anti-imperialism, this pro-Russia, pro-China view or way by which he views the world, viewpoint upon the world, where he observes Muslims who are standing up to these regimes to be insignificant. So Syria is an example.
Or agents of the West in the CIA.
Or agents of the West. Yeah. So he regards all of the Syrian opposition to be agents of the West. His view about the Uyghurs is that the Chinese government are fighting a war on terror. This is a term he used, a war on terror against the Uyghurs, because these people are
Salafist terrorists.
And so he effectively uses an American narrative. This is what the Americans say about Muslims in Iraq, what the Americans said about Muslims all over the Middle East that they went to war with, and in Afghanistan, of course. So I would never platform someone like that, because I know by platforming him, we're putting him on a pedestal. We're giving him an opportunity to be liked by the Muslim community, where in fact, I think part of the Muslim vote conversation, and it's a conversation I have with brothers from the Muslim vote team all the time, part of what we should be trying to do is we should be trying to build political literacy within the Muslim ummah. And part of that is we need to be able to have a Muslim community that is able to distinguish between those who are real allies and those who are actually our opponents. And I would go as far as to say George Galloway is our opponent. I don't think he's an ally. And I think politically, it's a naive position to be in, where we, for our short-term objectives, we defend him and we platform him. Now, that's my personal view, by the way.
It's an interesting
good question. I think, when it comes to moral positions and social positions, sometimes it's tricky, actually, very tricky. But I think on political positions, you don't have to be a Muslim to recognize that what the Uyghurs are experiencing is nothing short of a cultural, if not a physical genocide.
Absolutely.
Right? And so you don't have to be a Muslim and have a higher value system of wala wal bara to be able to come to that type of conclusion. It's just, you just have to follow political events, and you actually have to be pretty perverse to say otherwise. And I would go as far as to say people like Galloway are politically perverse when they back Assad, because it's convenient for their worldview, or back the regime of China because it's convenient for their worldview. So I think there's a difference. I hope you can see that difference. Whereas, for example, there are some inevitably you invite a non-Muslim onto your platform, and even some Muslims onto your platform. They're not going to necessarily agree with every single moral position that you have, because these moral positions come from a series of conversations you have with Islam, right? You don't need to have that conversation with Islam to know that these people, that the Chinese regime or the Assad regime, are committing crimes against their people.
Let's go back a bit and let's look beyond George Galloway, right? And let's look at the general thinking that does exist among some Muslims.
Yeah,
is that number one, having competing superpowers instead of Pax Americana, but having competing superpowers, and talk of BRICS and stuff like that. In fact, there's one prominent content creator who speaks to himself and rarely gives interviews, if ever. Talks about the forming of some level of political autonomy. Siding with China and Russia against the West's hegemony and stuff like this. Those who do believe of the axis of resistance type of thinking, many Pakistanis look favorably to China, as do other Muslim countries. You'll speak to many people who have favorable opinions towards Russia, simply because they see them as a balancing act or a better or lesser evil to America. How do you address those issues? They will have favorable positions towards Russia and China because they're so anti-West, and anything that's anti-West becomes pro-Muslim. Do you see problems with this type of thinking?
I see problems with this type of thinking because so as Muslims, the way by which we observe the world has to be according to an Islamic framework of thinking. And part of the Islamic framework of thinking is that we want ultimately to design a world built upon Islamic principles. Now, that's not an Al-Qaeda, ISIS type of attitude. That's we want to revitalize a order that's built on those principles that undergirded the international system, until the 1920s, when the last Ottoman Caliphate fell, right? So in our mind, we want to be the masters over our own narrative. We want to be the ones who make history, not the ones who are constantly under the thumb of one major power or the other. The problem with these narratives is that it plays to the weakest position we can ever be in, and that is that Muslims can only be in a multipolar world full of great powers. Muslims can only be an insignificant power under these multiple poles, right? And I find that a problematic language because, of course, we want to build our ummah to a position where we are one of these great powers, and where we are able to design history, and where we are able to do the subject of ordering. We are able to order the world. So I would say that there needs to be some deep thinking about international politics, actually. Now, by the way, I don't disagree with the idea that the more the world becomes multipolar, the more America's grip on this world is going to decline. So I agree with that narrative. And I agree that as China rises in particular, because China actually is the only real competitor to, Russia is not that competitor. China is the only real competitor to America. And China has the economic, cultural, political weight to balance against American power. So we're observing, America at its height and now slowly receding in the world, and the rise of China as this potential superpower. And the question we should ask ourselves is, where do we fit into that, right? Now, I'm not in any way suggesting then that we should look at this and say it's all bad because these are all non-Muslim countries. We want American power to recede in the world. I say this to American Muslims all the time, who suddenly believe in an American exceptionalism, that it's in your interest, because it's in the Ummah's interest, for American hegemony to decline in the world. And you have to think, as an American Muslim, how are you going to contribute to that? Now, of course, a lot of American Muslims have a heart attack at this stage when you say that. But we have to think like that because, we want a world where a space opens up for the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim world, right? So that the good politicians in the Muslim world can start utilizing that space. For the last 20, 30 years, under American unipolarity, the Muslim Ummah has not been able to sneeze without the Americans catching us, right? They've not been able to do anything. American power is receding, China's power is rising, and that is slowly opening up a space in the Muslim world. We've just got to make sure we utilize that space to our advantage. Now, the problem with these, just to give you one final...
Do you think BRICS could be a space?
No, because the BRICS system is too heavily sided towards these unsavory powers like China and Russia. And so, at best, the BRICS will be an opportunity to help us open up a space in the Muslim world. But the BRICS system, if by the way, the BRICS system it's not an analogous system to say NATO. It's a very it's an organization that is not cohesive, and actually has some lots of internal divisions, India and China being one of them, right?
Of course.
So the BRICS system isn't particularly a cohesive system. We need to just recognize that BRICS system for what it is. And maybe the BRICS system will give us a space, especially in the economic realm,